You know, folks, there are some games where when you pick them up and try to play them, that you start to question why you even bother doing reviews in the first place. Because a game like this comes along, and, I gotta be perfectly honest with you, folks. I have no idea who this game was actually designed for. Because I thought it was designed for me at first. I'm big into space games, I'm big into space exploration, and exploring strange new worlds and all that sort of thing, you know, sci-fi. But this isn't really that. It's not about exploration, not really. No, you know exactly how this game is going to go within the first few minutes of gameplay. And even though they have updated the game over the course of the year or so it's been out, it hasn't really changed anything. Oh sure, it does toss a few new things in there to mess around with, but the core gameplay is no different. Nor are the problems that there were on launch. There's still massive glitches in there that have been in there since day one and have still not been fixed. There's various exploits that are in there that have still not been fixed. And at this point, I don't care. Because, to be perfectly honest with you, when I played this game, the only thing I could think while playing it, while experiencing what the game had to offer, it only took me about 20 minutes to come to this conclusion. This is quite simply the most soulless, tedious, and vapid video game I have ever played in my life. I can't help but wonder if the game was deliberately meant to be a joke. Whether it was meant to be some kind of bizarre satire of current video game trends, or whether it was meant to be some art project, or whether it's just part of some bizarre social experiment meant to figure out some strange esoteric thing about the gamer mentality. But regardless of why it was made or what it's hoping to achieve, it only achieves one thing. And that is to be the most soul-crushingly boring game in existence. I am not exaggerating when I say that Cookie Clicker has more depth and enjoyment than this game does. I am not exaggerating when I say that I legitimately had so much more fun playing Ride to Hell Retribution than this. Because you know what? I can work with bad games. Because bad games, generally speaking, you can either find things to laugh about, or they just irritate me enough to the point where I can actually sit there and rant about them for a while. But what I cannot work with is something that is boring. Particularly if something is as boring as this game. Based on my previous experiences, I had thought that the original Diablo was the single most boring game that I would ever encounter. It turns out that that statement was rather naive, because I had not played No Man's Sky. So I guess let's go ahead and start delving into this game and finding out why it's a problem, first with some basic information, which is that it was a sort of space exploration, but really more of a survival game, developed by Hello Games, and it was first announced in 2013, but it didn't get released until 2016. And when it was first unveiled to us, it looked like something that was kind of a dream of mine, a proper space exploration game where you hop into your ship, you fly out into space, and then you just explore the stars and see what there is to see. And they were pretty tight-lipped on what you actually do in the game, up until the game's release, which then became one of the most infamous video game releases in really the entire history of the industry. Now, I don't really want to go into details about the game's development, because honestly, it doesn't really matter at this point. The game released, it is the way it is, and they've been updating it ever since. It's worth noting that I am not only playing the PS4 version, and that is what you're seeing in this video, but I also did not pick up the game until quite a long time after its release. In fact, it was well over a year after its release, and they'd already put out quite a few updates for the game, including some brand new content. And you may be thinking, but DW, you normally play PC games if you can get them on PC. That is correct, normally I do. But No Man's Sky never goes below about $24 on PC. I got this for half of that on PS4. It was actually the cheapest game in the entire PS4 section of the store, and I have regretted that purchase ever since. So let's go ahead and start delving right into this thing and finding out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, the presentation is impressive at first, but once you realize how samey everything is throughout the course of the game, then it starts to lose its luster. The modeling is solid. The first-person animations for the multi-tool are fairly basic, but they get the job done, and when you actually encounter alien creatures, generally speaking, they're pretty well animated. The texture quality is not particularly great, but at the same time, it's also not particularly bad, so there is that. And of course, there is the aesthetic, which is definitely very bright and colorful and very appealing to the eye, but unfortunately, like I said, everything is very samey. Once you've visited a few planets, you notice how pretty much everything tends to look the same, just with maybe a few palette swaps, or sometimes you'll even notice the same exact flora and fauna on numerous planets as you're exploring, and it just takes you out of the experience. Once you move beyond the visuals, you find that the sound design is generally alright, but there are certain sound effects that are just annoying after a while, namely things like the multi-tool's mining laser. But even among the sound effects that aren't annoying like that, it's nothing that will really get you going, and everything has a fairly low impact to it. Beyond that, there's a bit of voice acting in the sense of the suit constantly tells you when you're running low on charge and when you've actually recharged and that sort of thing. But it's this highly electronic voice that just grates on your nerves after a while because you will be hearing it constantly and it gets very irritating. And of course, whenever you run into other life forms, they just start babbling in their own language, which just sounds like a bunch of weird noises to use, so it's not like it even counts as voice acting. But there is one saving grace about the sound design, and that is that the soundtrack in the game is actually very good. It was done by 65 Days of Static. They're an experimental rock band, and what you end up with is a soundtrack that consists of a mixture of electronic and rock, and it just ends up working out pretty well. So if nothing else, they did a pretty decent job with the presentation all around. It's just that things get pretty repetitive pretty quickly, but that's something that's more related to gameplay than anything else. This of course leads me into what really matter here, which are the story, or really lack thereof, and the gameplay. You see, when the game launched, there was no story. You just wandered out into the galaxy and explored everything. And when you go into the current version of the game, as of the Atlas Rises update, there actually is a storyline, which is extremely bare bones and is frankly not even worth bothering with. The basic idea is that the player character wakes up and has no idea who they are or why they're where they are or what anything is really. And once you start wandering around and exploring, you end up actually finding out that the story of the game centers around a race known as the Travelers and their role in the universe, as well as this thing known as the Atlas, which you find various interfaces for throughout the galaxies, and you just kind of have to piece the story together as you're going along. Now, before the Atlas Rises update, this wasn't even actually a coherent storyline. You would just explore, and eventually you'd come across an Atlas interface, and maybe you'd be able to piece together the story through hours upon hours upon hours of play. But now that there actually is an explicit story mode in this, you are given at least a basic understanding of what the universe of No Man's Sky is about, and when you actually look further into it, it becomes painfully obvious extremely quickly that the developers thought they were much better writers than they actually are. Because, frankly, it's impossible to give a crap about the story of No Man's Sky. The actual storytelling has this faux vagueness about it, where it's trying its hardest to seem like something that is way more intelligent than it actually is, and you end up with something that just ends up being vague for the sake of being vague. Because when the actual secrets of the story are finally revealed to you, you go, oh, that's it? And even worse than that, there's no proper ending to the game. Once you get to the end of the storyline, it actually explicitly tells you, okay, you have completed the storyline, now go explore. So even though they did include a storyline in the game eventually, they just put it in there as a total afterthought, and really none of the story or the lore actually has any real depth behind it, because, I mean, why should you care? None of what you're interacting with has anything at all to do with the lore. Because now we come to the real meat of the game and the main problem that it has, which is the central question of, what do you do in No Man's Sky? Well, when you start the game up, you have a ship that's horrendously damaged and a multi-tool that is damaged, and you end up having to just set about repairing all of those. This takes you roughly 30 minutes to an hour. After that, you can continue to explore the planet you start on, or you can hop into your ship, go off into space, and try to explore the system. But for the sake of argument, let's just say you decide to stick around on the planet you start on and just explore. Well, what are you going to find? You're going to find a whole lot of the same things scattered around the entire planet. There are going to be roughly 5 or 6 different bits of flora, and on any given planet you're going to find anything from 1 to about 7 or so life forms that you'll be able to scan in. Whenever you scan a rock or a plant or a life form or whatever it may well be, the game will give you an amount of units, which is just the basic currency. You can use that currency to buy things at galactic trade hubs, or if you encounter various aliens, you can interact with them and sometimes give them units in order to get various effects or to not get various effects. They're also used for repairing slots on your various equipment, so let's just say you have a few slots on your multi-tool that are listed as damaged. Well, you can pay an amount of units to have that slot opened back up. There's also an additional currency known as nanite clusters, and while these do take an inventory slot, they are much more useful than units when you get down to it. This is only because more NPCs will actually accept nanite clusters than they will units, and you'll be able to trade for various blueprints and such like that for them. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going through the game and if you might encounter some nanite clusters. But like I said, they take up an inventory spot, which is going to become a problem that you're going to run into constantly throughout the entire game, because you're going to be carrying around as much crap as you possibly can. This is because the game is not really about exploring space, it's not really about uncovering the secrets of the universe. It is about collecting various resources so you can build various components that make it easier to collect resources. Let me reiterate that. It is entirely about grinding to make it easier to keep grinding. Nearly every world you go to is going to be either toxic or cold or radiated or whatever the hazardous environment may be, which is going to take its toll on your exosuit's shielding functionality. And after your shielding functionality is depleted, you're going to find that your life support is rapidly dwindling as opposed to just slowly dwindling. You can recharge both your life support and your shielding with various resources that you will find scattered around the universe, as well as various things you can craft. This all, of course, makes it so you can continue wandering around and collecting resources, which you can then use to either, of course, replenish your suit's functionalities, but also to craft new items, which can either be installed into your suit, or your multi-tool, or your ship, or you'll use them to craft more advanced materials that you can then use to craft more advanced components or more advanced fuels. What's that? You want to travel to an entirely new system? Well, you need to get a hyperdrive. First you need to find the blueprint for it, and then you need to collect all of the resources you need to build it. Then you build it, and you don't have any fuel for it, so you need to go find a fuel cell for it. It gives you 1 charge, which allows you to move 1 system. Eventually you collect a blueprint that will allow you to build warp cells, which are what fuels your hyperdrive and allows you to go from system to system. Naturally, to craft these warp cells requires advanced materials that require some fairly rare things that you can find scattered around the various planets and such. So you wander around, you find all the resources, you craft all the advanced materials, and then you build the warp cells and you throw them into your hyperdrive, you move to the next system, and you repeat the process. Along the way, you will probably be crafting various components that will give you small incremental bonuses to your life support functionality or your shielding or the amount of charge you have in your mining laser before it overheats or any number of things like that. And those make it very, very slightly easier to collect more materials so you can then craft more components and just keep repeating the cycle. You may occasionally encounter a hostile life form or a sentinel that attacks you, but taking them out is pathetically easy, because either your multi-tool will be able to have a bolt caster attachment that allows you to shoot it like a laser gun, or you can just use the mining laser on it and it'll do less damage, sure, but it'll still keep damaging it until eventually you take it down. The combat just ends up being extremely bare bones and extremely tedious, so you'll probably try to avoid it as much as you can. But the funny thing is, even if you do manage to get into a fight, even if it's in space for example, you're never really going to die, because guess what? You can just go collect a few resources from the nearby asteroid field in order to replenish all of your shielding like it's nothing. This means that combat becomes a completely pointless gesture, because you will always win every single fight you get into, and even if you do manage to die somehow, it doesn't matter, because you'll just respawn at whatever last checkpoint you had like it was nothing. That is, of course, unless you're playing the permadeath mode, but who in their right mind would play the permadeath mode? So other than the bare-bones storyline and the constant grinding for the sake of grinding and the ridiculously wimpy combat, what do you do in No Man's Sky? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that is really nothing. I mean, they do have some vague semblance of multiplayer in the game now, to where you can run into other players, but they only show up as a glowing orb, and they don't really have much effect on your game either. You can put together a base, and then as you continue on your exploration, you can dismantle the previous one and build a brand new one to get all the same benefits and everything, and that's kinda it, really. There's still really no point to the game other than get to the center of the galaxy, and when you do finally get to the center of the galaxy, it literally just has New Game Plus, because you start up in the exact same manner that you did when you started the game in the first place. It displays the initialize screen, and then you initialize, and you wake up, and your ship is crashed with several damaged components, and you have to repair them all over again. And what happens in this new galaxy, pray tell? Well, exactly the same thing that happened in the previous one. You just go from planet to planet, you collect resources, so you can collect more resources in the long run. Nothing really changes. You're still encountering the same aliens. You're still encountering creatures that look eerily similar to the ones you saw before, and everything just keeps going exactly the way you'd expect it to after having played the game already. Frankly, it's just insulting, because when you get down to it, the entire game is completely pointless. What is ultimately the goal in No Man's Sky? It's certainly not the storyline, because they only added that several patches in and it was a total afterthought. It's certainly not multiplayer, because there's not really anything you can do in the multiplayer. It's definitely not combat, because the combat is so bare bones and barely even in the game at all. And it's not even really exploration, because even though the game sets itself up to be basically a game about exploration, you're never the first one to discover anything. Oh, it'll say that you were the first one to scan something into a database, sure, but when you actually are on the planet, there is always a base, and there is always an alien inside that base. That's right, the game even robs you of the ability to say you were the first one to discover insert planet here or insert type of flora or fauna here. Because at the end of the day, the AI already did it. But it's not like it matters all that much when pretty much everything looks the same, because the entire game is procedurally generated and not particularly well at that. Oh sure, there are a lot of planets to find, but you'd be amazed how many of them look almost exactly the same as the one you were just on. And after about maybe 5 to 6 planets, you've seen pretty much everything there is to see. It's frankly insulting to your intelligence. And thus you ultimately come to the realization that there really is no point to No Man's Sky. Maybe earlier in the game's development it did have a point, but now it doesn't. It's just there to perpetuate its endless grind. And the funny thing about that is, it can't even do that competently. I mean, for example, the mining laser actually has an overheat mechanic, but whenever the bar turns red, you just let go of the fire button for a moment and then immediately go back to firing, and it just automatically resets the entire bar. You don't even have to wait for it to cool down like you're supposed to, or like what happens when it actually does overheat. That exploit has been in the game since launch, and they still haven't fixed it. There's also numerous graphical glitches where items will spawn in weird spots, like they're floating, for example. Or I had one instance where the actual signal beacon that I was supposed to go activate spawned in the middle of a planet as opposed to on the surface, so I couldn't actually get to it. You have the ability to learn alien languages in order to decipher their incomprehensible babble, but you learn it literally one word at a time, and with some of these languages you're looking at upwards of 600 or 700 words in order to actually be able to understand what they're saying. It all just becomes immensely frustrating to deal with, and ultimately the soul-crushing boredom sets in before you even get out of the tutorial, let alone by the time you're actually doing anything that could be vaguely construed as interesting. Which ultimately leads me to my conclusion. Objectively, this is a bad game. A very bad game. And that gives it a 1.5 out of 5. And that is, of course, the ultimate summary that I give it, but at the same time, when you actually play it, it feels a lot worse than a 1.5 out of 5, simply because it is so soul-crushingly boring. It is the prime example of why you should never, under any circumstances, give in to hype culture, because what you end up with here is something so shallow, vapid, and soulless that it has absolutely no worth whatsoever other than being a cautionary tale. Avoid No Man's Sky like the plague. Thanks for watching.